Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are celebrating America Saves season, and topic today is successful savings strategies, behavioral economics research. So delighted to have this panel of experts with us today. We've tagged in Dr. Lauren Jones, who is assistant professor and state specialist at The Ohio State University, and with her are associate professor and state specialist also at the Ohio State University, Dr. Cazilia. Dr. Becky Smith is here from Mississippi State University, and Khurram as a program instructor, financial ownership education with Michigan State University. So glad to have them all here today. And please continue to, you can use the Q&A if you have questions, and we'll be wrangling those questions as we go along. We'll let our presenters go through their slideshow, their presentation, and then we'll be happy to have them respond to any questions that you've submitted. So take it away, Lauren.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this presentation. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get our slides up here. And get going. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about savings techniques and insights from the field of behavioral economics. So Laura gave us a nice little introduction, but just to sort of give us all an idea of where we're going, we're going to start off hearing from Dr. Becky Smith. She's going to explain a little bit about how behavioral economics can help us reveal our biases that can prevent people from saving. Then we'll hear from Dr. Cazilia Loibl, who's here with me in sunny Columbus, Ohio at The Ohio State University. And she's going to explain a little bit about this idea of nudges and what they are. I'll then talk a little bit about what the research shows in this area. And our wonderful program instructor, Khurram Imam from Michigan State, is going to sort of sum it all up for us at the end and give us an idea of how these techniques can actually be applied in the field. So I'll pass things over to Becky to get us started.
All right, great. Thanks, Lauren. So we're going to talk about behavioral economics and showing our biases. So we're going to start with the traditional economic model, among other things, that assumes that individuals are rational and have perfect information. So wealth maximizers are said to take action or behave to make themselves better off in the long run. So in the context of saving, it might look like this. If I'm better off in the long run by saving today, then I save today. So while that may be predictive in some cases, if we look around the real world, it's much messier than that. So while that model is useful in many contexts, our finances and our health choices, it has not been so predictive. Oftentimes we have information, right? Many of us work with people that don't have information, but even when we do have information, we don't act in ways that we know that we should. So a little bit of evidence there. So when I am with my audiences and we're talking about, we're together in order to understand our decision making better and hopefully improving it, I start with the question, how many of you have made choices that you knew that you shouldn't make? And then we talk about that. The next question that I'm going to skip that slide. Good. The next question that I start with them is to ask, well, what's the best indicator of future behavior? And we ask this question because we're trying to figure out, trying to get a more realistic understanding of how do we improve our future behavior, and eventually we get to the answer of past behavior. So I would love to see what y'all think about that on the chat. So please feel free to jump in there. So we have to tackle that reality of past behavior being our best predictor. And in order to delve in a little bit more on this topic, I go through an exercise that I created from the material in Dr. Kelly McGonigal's The Willpower Instinct. So it's a present self versus future self activity. Go ahead and forward it. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. So if you would just kind of reflect at your desk there, when making decisions, how much do you generally take into account your future self? So let us hear about that in the chat. Now, if you're a person that takes into account your future self a lot in your decision making, then you would choose one of the images where there's a lot of overlap. But maybe when you're younger, or maybe you know people that really they're making their decisions for today, then they would be choosing an image where there's a lot more separation or a lot less overlap. So a few questions that are also very helpful in providing us insight as to where we really are in our decision making on our future self and present self are the following. So is there an important change or task that you are putting off, hoping that a future you with more willpower will show up? Lauren, can you advance? There we go. So as you're sitting there, how much is this true for you? How about this question? This is one of my favorite questions. Do you optimistically overcommit yourself to responsibilities only to find yourself overwhelmed by impossible demands? So that's, I know a lot of people in Extension that have to say, ooh, I do that a lot. So I'm wondering where you are on that spectrum. How about, do you talk yourself out of something today, telling yourself that you'll feel more like it tomorrow? So obviously these, how we go about making our decisions has a lot to do with the impact on our choices, specifically our impact on our savings. So each one of these has come from a finding from behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is, I'm just going to skip that one. Behavioral economics is the coming together of the cognitive and behavioral psychology and economics and the work is done in experiments, and what's happened is that because of the experimental approach, you get to have a lot more realism put in there. And so the study is really now about how individuals manage risk. Specifically, behavioral finance tackles those unpredicted, irrational financial decisions. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, are the biases that have been revealed that are more, so there's a lot of these biases that have been revealed, and I'm going to talk about just a couple of them today. But what we have learned, one of the main findings, is that because of the overwhelming amount of information that's out there, all of the decisions that we have to make, we find shortcuts in order to be able to process all that. And so we rely on rules of thumb. Fancier words would be heuristics or algorithms, but basically they're ways that we go about solving problems or processing information. And unfortunately, some of these shortcuts result in what we call biases that result in these unanticipated, irrational, or illogical behavior. So again, a bias is just a systematic error that we make, and it recurs predictably in certain situations. So behavioral economics doesn't say that all humans are irrational creatures. It's simply that in particular situations we see patterns of behavior that come up over time that are irrational. So the predictably irrational, if you've heard that term, the predictably comes from those distinctive patterns, and the irrational from the inconsistency with what a rational person would be doing. So a few of these biases, the anchoring, I'm going to start with the anchoring bias, and that's simply that we're influenced by standards, benchmarks and numbers when we shouldn't be. So if we're reading something or if we're listening to something and they throw out a number, our tendency is to place a lot of weight on that number, even if that number's actually even irrelevant. So another example would be the engagement ring, the 2-month salary standard that presumably some jeweler made up, and it's now caught on, and it's just this random number. So a tip there is to be careful which numbers and standards that we use when we are making decisions. Another bias that we see is the mental accounting bias. That is our tendency to separate money from certain income sources as well as for certain expenses. Certain expenses. So an example would be that people treat found money differently than they do the income from their normal income stream. So there is no secret why America Saves is celebrating this time of year. We're really focused on helping individuals spend those tax returns productively. And so the tip there really is to think about money as money. And we want to be using it in our highest and best use. So the hindsight bias, when someone concludes that a past event was predictable and obvious when it really couldn't have been. And what happens is that in our minds, we become overconfident about our future behavior. And so you'll hear a lot of times if you've heard people say, well, things are really tight. It'll be better, in the future, I'm going to save more tomorrow, or, tomorrow I'm going to start my diet. And so the tip there is, of course, that every new day is going to have its challenges. We do take ourselves wherever we go. The herd behavior bias is simply that we follow the bandwagon due to social pressure, and there is a thought that people that fall into the trap that people think that large groups can't be wrong, when of course we know that they can be. So it's always good to have someone to be able to help you ask questions and make sure that you have proper perspective. All right, so where are we now? We have learned a lot about the way that humans violate the rules of rationality. So we have a lot of information and research on that, but we are really much in a state of transition. We have a lot of ground to cover when it comes to improving those decision-making at the individual and society level. And you're going to hear about some really exciting things that are happening on the societal level. I'm just going to mention something at the individual level. So we are finding ways and tools to help individuals. And go ahead and go to the next slide. And you can see this in the paradigm shift with financial education, right? The model of best practice of financial education is really changing from the sage on the stage, where the expert is delivering rules that people should follow. Because we know now, the research shows us that that sends us into these shame states, and doesn't help us. And so we care about the behavior, the impact, the outcome of our education. And so go ahead and go to the next slide. The focus on the coaching, for example, is it is one example of how the research is playing out and changing the way that we engage with our clients. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple more resources that I use when I engage my audiences, but that's what I have for you.
Great. Thank you very much, Becky. That was a great introduction. I want to open up the floor for a moment to just have a look and see in the Q&A. I don't see any questions up right now. So since we do have so much to cover, maybe the best thing to do is keep moving along with Cecilia's presentation and come in with some questions after that. So feel free to ask any questions in that Q&A box. And I will move things over to Cecilia. Cecilia, you're on mute.
It's going to be in the lower left-hand corner.
You hear me?
There we go. Thank you.
Here we go. Thank you very much. I follow up to Becky's presentation by focusing on nudges. And I would like to start with this famous quote from the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. A nudge, as we will use the term in the book, is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way, without forbidding any options or without significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid also. Nudges are not mandates. Putting the fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. In this presentation, I would like to share with you some insights into the concept of nudges, different types of nudges, how to plan a nudge, and also share some more background readings. What are nudges? As the quote said, it's policy initiatives mostly that preserve freedom of consumer choice. They are informed by behavioral economics and psychology, and they are meant to promote important consumer goals. From our perspective, improved financial security, but they are also often focused on health and safety. What are goals of nudges? I would say to remove everyday barriers to saving, debt repayment, and financial planning. The focus here is on everyday small barriers. To use behavioral biases to benefit savings decisions. Also very important is, with regards to nudges, that they are low cost, replicable, and allow for large-scale intervention. Ideally, they are effective with low or no attention required. Yeah, let's move to what types of nudges we can choose from. And Daniel Kahneman, in his famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he defined two types of nudges. The first group he called System 1 nudges. These are fast, effortless, automatic, affective decisions linked to emotions, the desire to go shopping, for example. Non-conscious, some call them mindless. The second group are the System 2 nudges, which is the slow, the effortful decision-making. It's rule-based, it's deliberate, it's very conscious decision procedures, and you can call it mindful. Example for System 1 nudges are adding a picture of oneself in older age to a retirement savings account. Has been shown to be very effective. Or labeling a savings account for children as a child savings account to prevent parents from accessing the funds. To provide account fees in dollars instead of percentage. And most famously and most importantly, to make savings contributions automatic. Examples for System 2 nudges are information campaigns about good savings habits, like the America Saves campaign, perfect example. Information about how to repay a credit card in 36 months from the Card Act on our credit card statements. Also very effective are goal-specific emails or text reminders about making savings deposits. When you ask people which nudges they prefer, and I think that's an important question, typically people tell us that they prefer System 2 nudges. They prefer interventions that are more obvious, more transparent, and that engage their deliberate thinking. Those are the system 2 nudges, especially in important contexts, and financial decisions are important decisions. People want to feel in control of these more important decisions and not rely on fast, impulsive processes. That's understandable. However, once participants are explained the differences and that system 1 nudges can be much more effective than system 2 nudges, they tend to change. In changing behavior, people tend to switch their approval. And I would like to show you some numbers because it's so interesting. A survey asked, which of these policies do you prefer as part of a campaign to encourage people to save for retirement? On the left, you see the system 1 nudge, automatic enrollment of employees in savings plans, subject to opt-out if employees do not want to participate. This option got an approval rate of 43%. The system 2 nudge, also a very classic example, financial literacy programs at the workplace so that employees are educated about retirement options. When you ask people, just providing these 2 nudges, more than half would prefer the system 2 nudge. But Lauren, move on. If survey participants are told that the system 1 nudge is far more effective, now more than half, 55%, prefers the system 1 nudge, and the system 2 nudge is only preferred by 45%. If additional information is provided, at system 1 nudges lead 90% of workers to enroll in savings plans, whereas the system 2 nudge leads only 55% to enroll in savings plans. We have another tiny gain of 1 percentage point. What I wanted to emphasize here is that we should not hesitate to use system 1 nudges, but we need to explain it to our participants, to the people we target with a nudge, what it is about, and then it might work better. But to the most important piece here is how to plan a nudge. And Lauren, move on. So I see 4 steps. The first one is to map the context, then to select the nudge, third, to identify the triggers for nudging, and fourth, to experiment and iterate, very important. So the first step means that we understand the decision-making process behind making savings deposits and determine the main biases and influences. An example is that we want to encourage monthly savings, but the biases we have to overcome, all of us, is tunnel vision, that we focus on the today, on the current months, and neglect longer-term financial planning. It's a peanuts effect, that we at smaller amounts, making decisions about smaller amounts, there's larger savings amounts. Also, another bias is that we might be focused on the present and not think about the future that much. Then, when this environment is analyzed, we can select the nudge. For example, asking people in a savings program to make smaller, more frequent deposits, provide reminder texts or emails, give a match or a bonus payment if a certain savings goal is reached. Then the next step is to situate the nudge. So here we have to look into identifying possible constraints and areas where the nudges are best implemented. Here are a couple of questions to consider. For example, how do people make savings deposits? If we ask them to make a weekly deposit, is this feasible, or a bi-weekly deposit? Is there a preference for text versus calls versus emails? What is the best timing of reminders? Possibly around payday. Do we know the payday? It might differ. And the last step is to experiment and iterate. And I can't emphasize this last step enough. It is to prioritize the nudges and test for their effectiveness. Let's not test all at once. Test one nudge first and then add others. To collect savings deposit data and analyze them. Just compare the means already helps. And also very important to interview or survey the participants, to talk to the people. What did you like about the nudge? What did it help you save or not? Recommendations here are, to summarize, is we want to design nudges and remove every day small barriers to saving, debt repayment, and financial planning. Ideally, we want to aim for simple nudges that are easy to implement, replicable, low cost. Combine nudges with other interventions like our more general financial planning programs or with credit counseling programs. Know the target group. Very important. What are the habits? What are the decision-making procedures of our target group? Test nudges before using them widely, because they can be ineffective and they can backfire. And Lauren will talk more about this aspect. And social scientists can help. We are there to help you design your nudges and help you evaluate the data. Take advantage of our expertise here on campus. And I wanted to share some more readings. A very important paper by colleagues at Princeton and Harvard in Science about some consequences of having too little, and the related book Scarcity that they wrote on how we make financial decisions in tight financial situations, in financial hardship situations. It's excellent. Already the paper, it's short, but very much to the point, very readable. Next slide. Thank you, Lauren. I also wanted to point you to a book called A Fragile Balance. It talks about emergency savings. And a second book, the Handbook of Consumer Finance Research, where many colleagues devoted a chapter to explain how financial decisions, savings decisions are made. Thank you very much for your attention. Please keep in touch.
Great. Thank you, Cazilia. I see a couple questions in the Q&A, so I think we have a few minutes to address some of these. So D. Golding wants to know if the slides will be available after the webinar, and they will be available on the Learn event page. And Maria asked if we have any examples of nudges that have worked well with limited income audiences, and that is a perfect lead-in to what I'm about to talk about. So thank you, Maria, for that great question. And I will keep your questions coming in the Q&A section, and we will move on to see what the research has shown, which of these nudges are effective. So we started out with Becky's explanation of the behavioral biases that can prevent people from saving. And then we heard from Cazilia on specific nudges, what a nudge is and how we can structure savings programs to sort of encourage and make savings easier, such that it's easier for people to overcome these biases. So there's been a lot of research on how effective nudges are, especially in the savings and debt repayment field. So Richard Thaler, one of the sort of grandfathers of behavioral economics, has this quote saying that retirement savings is probably behavioral economists' greatest success story. So really in the savings field, these identifying behavioral biases and designing nudges to overcome them has really been extremely effective. So a lot of the research that's been produced in this area has been done either in lab experiments in early stages, and then also evaluated in field experiments where kind of large savings programs using the nudges are randomly assigned to savers in the field, usually among low-income populations. A lot of them have been evaluated in the context of workplace retirement savings programs, and still more have been evaluated in not only the US, but in low-income countries. So I'm going to talk about some of the research on nudges that we've found to be very successful to help people save and reduce debt. So the first thing I want to talk about is the impact that defaults have had on savings. So a default nudge is when we, rather than sort of requiring that people opt in to participate in a savings program, they're defaulted into participation in the program. So this has been especially relevant, especially in the context of workplace retirement programs. So in many workplace retirement programs, if you want to participate in your workplace program, you need to sort of opt into the program. And many researchers have evaluated what happens if, rather than requiring people to opt in, the default to participate, the default is participating in the retirement program. So I just want to show you this great figure from this Bashir's article that shows the participation rate in a workplace retirement savings program by month of working at a company. So you can see over in the left-hand corner of the figure, we have people who are just joining, and we've got 3 lines tracking out here. The lighter gray line tells us the participation in the retirement savings program for those who were hired but were not given the default enrollment option. The other 2 darker black lines show the retirement participation rate for employees that were hired but were defaulted into enrollment in the program. So you can see there's a 40 percentage point difference in participation in the retirement savings program at 1 month, after 1 month of being hired at the business. The difference sort of narrows over time, so the people who were not defaulted into enrollment are sort of have caught up to some extent after 2 years of working, but they never catch up fully. Whereas the employees who are hired under automatic enrollment are sort of, they all are immediately enrolled, and very few of them drop out over time. Another kind of interesting thing here is that it didn't seem to make a difference of whether we automatically enroll people to save 3% of their income or 6% of the income. So even though these people, some of the treated participants were enrolled and required to deposit 6% of their income, we didn't see more of those participants dropping out. So it wasn't a matter of there sort of not being enough resources to save, because regardless of how much we required people to save, we still saw the same positive impacts. And there have been many papers examining the effect of defaults on savings participation. And thinking a little bit about why default options have such impressive effects, I think it's a good idea to kind of think about why people avoid starting to save. And there's been a lot of research that shows that it's in many cases not a matter of people sort of not having enough money, but especially in the case of retirement savings, it's the fact that individuals tend to put off making complex decisions. So when you join a new business, for example, or a new employer, you need to make a decision about how much you're going to save, how you're going to allocate your assets, etc. Especially for younger employers and employers with less experience, or employees with less experience, can be a very complex decision, and people can tend to sort of want to put it off. So this great Mandrian and Shea paper shows that the default option is really helpful for these employees because it sort of makes the decision for them and allows them to avoid making that complex decision themselves. The next idea I want to talk about is this idea of automatic escalation. So automatic escalation is when we sort of structure a savings program to default people into increasing their savings rate in the future. So we structure the program so that people don't need to make the decision to increase their savings rate. It automatically happens. And there's this wonderful book and research study called the Save More Tomorrow program, which many of you may have heard of, in which employers ask their employees today if they would agree to automatically increase their savings at the next pay raise. So rather than asking employees, will you start saving more today? Employers ask their employees, will you agree to increase your savings rate the next time you get a raise? So the nice impact of this is, or the nice effect of this is that people are able to increase their savings without having to decrease their consumption, right? So if I agree to increase savings next time I get a raise, I'm not even going to notice a change in my monthly budget, and it becomes much easier to make that increase. So this graph shows how effective the Save More Tomorrow plan is. So the light gray bar you can see over time is the savings rate among people who didn't participate in the Save More Tomorrow program. The blue bar, let's skip to the blue bar, shows the savings rate among people who agreed to the Save More Tomorrow program. So these are employees who agreed, at the time of my next raise, I agreed to increase my savings rate. And you can see that from 1998 till 2002, these employees saw a steady increase in their savings rate. The dark gray bar, on the other hand, are employees who didn't want to include the join the Save More Tomorrow program, but agreed to a one-time increase in their savings rate. So you can see that we've got this nice jump in the savings rate from 4.4% in 1998 to 9.1% in 1991. But as we move through time, these employees did not continue to increase their savings rate.
Mm-hmm.
So the nice thing I think about these studies is to show that these default options are really, really effective, not only in getting people to save, but also in increasing savings rates over time. The next nudge I want to talk about is one that Cazilia mentioned, which is one of these type 2 nudges of providing new information to savers. And the context I want to talk about here is rather not a savings context, but a debt reduction context. So I want to talk about a study that looked at the impact of the CARD Act, which was a legislation that was passed in 2009 and mandated the inclusion of this minimum payment box on all credit card statements. So if you all examine your own credit card statements from pre-2009, you won't see this, but you'll see this now on all your paper statements. And the purpose of this box was really to illustrate in a very clear way how much it costs people to carry credit card debt. I'm not going to go into the details of the information in the box right now, but the idea behind the box and the design of it was this idea that people, while they may know their annual percentage rate, they don't fully sort of internalize that information. And by providing the information in a very clear way as to exactly how much the APR is costing them, it allows them to sort of pay down their, or internalize the cost of carrying debt more significantly. So these graphs show us the impact that the CARD Act has. So the graph on the left shows the proportion of credit card users who reported having no debt before and after the CARD Act was passed. So that vertical line in February 2010 shows the date of the enactment of the policy, and we can see this slight increase in the rate of consumers who report having no credit card debt after that information started being displayed on credit card statements. The two graphs on the right-hand side of your screen show this same proportion, so the proportion of consumers who had no credit card debt before and after the CARD Act. But if you look at the sort of solid line in each of those pictures, this shows the effect among consumers who are more likely to have looked at their credit card statement. And we can see the effect even better illustrated in this case. So here we really see that simply including this information on credit card statements had a significant impact on the rate of people who repay their credit card in full every month. So we could really see an effective nudge at work here. Another idea that Cazilia and Becky talked about was this idea of mental accounting. So the fact that we naturally budget by putting money in jars, and even if we're not literally putting money in jars for different uses, we sort of put them in mental jars. So we have our kind of rent budget in our minds, our food budget, etc. So findings from the research literature show that if we're really explicit about creating off-limit savings mental account, then we may be better able to save. And this can be especially important for money that comes from sources other than regular income. So as Cazilia mentioned, at tax time, America Saves time, this can be a really important idea that we need to be able to sort of allocate our money into a savings mental account before we're able to spend it. Another important finding from this literature is that different time frames can produce different outcomes. So if I ask you to save $1 a day versus asking you to save $365 per year, this could create very different outcomes because of the fact that $1 in a day may not seem like very much, whereas asking you to save 365 all at once may seem like a larger task. The next type of nudge I want to talk about is an accountability nudge. So accountability is this idea that when we're responsible or we need to answer for our actions to a group of peers, that can be significant differences in the way we behave. And this has been especially relevant for savings. So a lot of research in the developing world especially has shown that the use of savings groups, where we need to sort of state our savings goal among a group of peers and then answer to them, report back on our behavior in meeting that goal, can really improve savings outcomes. So here we have some figures from this paper by Cast et al. From 2012 that shows the savings amounts among a group of savers, those who had a basic account and those who had who were offered a high interest rate on their savings account, and then those who were offered a self-help peer group accountability savings opportunity. So if you look at the top graph here, you can see that the line with the unfilled in circles shows the amount saved for savers that were offered just simply a basic savings account. The lighter gray line with the filled in circles shows the savings amount for those savers who are offered the self-help peer group opportunity. We could see a really improved savings outcome for these savers. And I think the really interesting thing is we can see about the same impact on the amount saved by offering peer self-help savings group as we did in offering a higher interest on the savings. So even the financial incentive is sort of, or the self-help group offers just as much incentive as a higher interest rate does. So this accountability can be really effective. The last thing I want to talk about is when nudges fail. So there are, of course, a lot of really excellent and impressive research findings of when these nudges have been really effective in improving savings behavior. But we've also seen instances when nudges have not sort of helped people save. So here we have savings over time in two groups. One group received a series of nudges, including an accountability nudge, as we mentioned. And we can see barely any difference between the savings rate in the group who got the nudges versus those who didn't. And I think the kind of interesting finding here is this idea that, yes, the nudges can really help people overcome psychological biases that may be preventing them from saving, but it can't necessarily help them overcome financial biases or financial limitations that won't sort of let them save, right? So I think we need to be cautious in sort of understanding these nudges as a cure-all for every limitation to saving. Okay, so why don't we, that's all I have to say, so I'm going to just have a look at the Q&A here. So Jerry is asking how we think about these interventions, which seem to focus on individual behavior within a broader context of the economic environments individuals live in. So Jerry, I think maybe that's a great question. I think we should leave that one till the end of the seminar, if that's okay with you. Okay, great. And Jerry says I answered his question, so I'm glad to hear that. And Barbara, I've also answered your question. I think some examples of nudges that have backfired or at least failed. So I think we will move on at this point to Khurram to hear about how nudges can be applied in the field.
Good evening, guys. Or good afternoon, rather. All right, so I'm Khurram from Michigan State University Extension. I'm just going to be talking about behavioral economics in the field and implementation tools. So a few questions that you that were asked earlier, or a few points of notes, were why don't we behave like we know we should? A lot of things seem common sense like. And the other question was, what is the best indicator of future behavior? Basically, past behavior. So those two things are challenged, or we can challenge those through behavioral interventions in the form of nudges and by identifying the biases and hoping to change them a little bit. And there's 3 examples that I'm going to show, 2 from my university. One's the Bean Game, and the other one's the SMART Goal. And then one from America Saves, an organization that's kind of nationwide, and there's a little bit of research involved with that as well. So the Bean Game, if you've never heard of it, I'm going to explain it very, very briefly, but there's also going to be a PDF that's going to be sent to you. But participants basically are broken up into a family unit, so like 3 to 4, and they are told to form a budget using beans as sort of income. There might be a few different categories that everybody has to that everybody deals with on a monthly basis, and the groups have to utilize as much of their income as possible for the upcoming month. And there's 2 sets. There's one with like the full income, and then another one with kind of like a short, if there's an emergency that occurred. Do you mind going to the next slide, Lauren? So in this Bean Game, once it's completed, we discuss how they felt about the activity. And as the instructor, I kind of lead the discussion, going through each categories and trying to find ways that people could make changes, or, the resources that are out there. So in the discussion, what I've noticed is, for example, if I talk about utilities category, people will, the group themselves, they'll mention how they can go on budget plans, or there's community assistance from different organizations within the area, and they go in depth with it and trying to explain it to the other participants. And some people will admit to their, to behaviors such as like, I don't know what to do. I sometimes just leave my past due bills unopened because I don't have any answers. So those kind of go hand in hand. The behavior interventions, the nudges, and the identifying biases that we discussed earlier, the 2 things that you would note from those are, nudges would be a positive reinforcement, because you're doing a budget. So you're kind of replicating a budget in a low stress environment. So, and that goes into where you're identifying biases, where it goes into mental accounting. You're seeing it in a low stress environment, and you're formulating your own as well as a participant. The other thing is, where people talked about leaving past due bills unopened, now they have a reason to avoid procrastination, because they have a few more options. The next activity that I use with participants is SMART Goals, and it's an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, realistic, and timely. Basically, it's a way of making goals that you actually can follow pretty easily. Mind going to the next slide? So the participants, they discuss their current behavior, and as a group we talk about what people's goals are, and kind of going through the steps, using one person as an example, so they have an idea of how in depth they need to go. So the nudge in this case for the behavior intervention would be peer pressure, unfortunately. And the cognitive bias is generally, when you don't have things written down, there's a lack of accountability. Kind of like, I want to do these things. It's not that you don't have the desire. It's just that you don't have necessarily a plan. So the SMART Goal kind of helps you formulate a plan. And it also, when you're talking about things like budgeting, it helps you with mental accounting. All right, so for my organization, the research findings showed, we use a curriculum called DollarWorks. It's from University of Minnesota, but last year we reached 36 different counties across Michigan and had 965 participants, so that's a pretty big sample size, I would say, and we had pre and post surveys, and we found that 85% began to write out a spending plan, 83% wrote SMART financial goals, 83% began tracking spending and income, and another 80% began to pay their bills on time. So there was a behavioral change that we saw, and this is qualitative where people are just filling out surveys, but we also had, I'm sorry, this is quantitative, but we also had qualitative where people would come back and give us comments like these specific things helped a lot. These were kind of like the game changers for our family units. A nationwide program that also did something that uses nudges and behavior intervention is America Saves. They had a youth employment program that had 3 components. One, they would employ youth. So they were partnered with local organizations. They would also partner with financial institutions that would offer free savings or free savings accounts to the youth who were in these programs. And America Saves was kind of the background organization overseeing this, and also sending information to the youth employees, telling them about the benefits, savings, etc. The results, as you see, is by the end of the summer, 58% of the youth had savings account, which was a 66% increase from the beginning. This overall was higher by 15% amongst the low-income 16 to 18-year-old range. So this made kind of a discernible change in people. And it seemingly made a long-lasting change as well, because 8 months later, 61% still were using their savings account within the last month or so. The behavioral nudge that the program used was they opened a savings account, and that was one of the system ones. There's system 2, I think that was system 1. And then cognitive bias was basically the previous kind of default plan for the youth was they would spend, whenever they would see money, they would spend it immediately. They didn't really have a savings plan, and that changed with the information that was kind of thrown at them, and so on. So, did anybody have any questions about the examples that I provided?
Okay, so we have a few questions. Here, Jerry says, okay, maybe I'll cover Bryce's question first. So Bryce asks whether we can get a copy of the Bean game to use, and whether there are other similar games that others would know about that would also be helpful. So Bryce, yes, we will upload a copy of the Bean game to the Learn event site. So you'll be able to download it there in a couple of days. And if anyone has any kind of other ideas for other games that could, emphasize or use nudges to help our program participants overcome behavioral biases, then please share those in the chat. In the meantime, I want to get to Jerry's comment here. So Jerry says that he thinks the findings in the most recent Fed report on economic well-being of the U.S. households would be interesting to consider through these frameworks to maybe better discern conditions under which these interventions might be effective and when they might be insufficient. So we've got Jerry's shared a link here, which we can share, I think, also in the chat window for those who might be interested. Thanks very much, Jerry, for sharing that. I'm going to have a look at that. And he also says that one of the key findings of the report was that income levels seem to have a significant influence on saving outcomes. So one question might be whether there is a threshold of discretionary income where these kinds of behavioral interventions become effective and below which they become insufficient. I think that's a great point, Jerry, that I was trying to make, that, you can't get blood from a stone. So if the kind of, the thing stopping someone from saving is that they just simply don't have enough money to cover their daily expenses, then certainly the nudges are not going to be effective. But, as we all know, in this country right now, we have, in many ways, a savings crisis that applies to not just people in that position, the position where they don't have enough money to cover their everyday expenses. So I think there is a lot that these nudges can do, but I'm really glad that you're emphasizing and pointing out and reminding us all that they're not a panacea. They're not going to fix problems for people who are sort of economically strapped. Do any of the other panelists want to chime in on that? Okay. I'm gonna look. I'm not sure how to look in the chat window. Laura and Mark, are you guys looking to see if anyone had any other activities they wanted to share with the group?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation there. I don't know, Laura, you may have been watching a little closer than me as far as specific questions go.
I did. We haven't had any additional questions there. I did put a suggestion in there for people if they wanted to share resources, they could do that. The couple that I've received, I will put in with the other materials that we will have linked in the Learn event. And I also put the federal report on economic well-being there in the chat because participants can click on it. So if you just want to click on that, and Jerry, you can look and make sure that that's the right link, but I think that's the one that you were using as well. So those resources are listed there in the chat if you want to look at that.
And I assume most people know where the Learn link is, but I just put that in chat too. And again, it'll probably take us a couple of days to get the recording processed and then get the various materials uploaded. But everything, the recording and then the recording, the presentation, and any additional materials should be linked inside this Learn event.
We have a couple more questions that have come up. It says, have you looked at any personality traits that may interact with effectiveness of the nudge? Just like income level, I would think that might have an effect. Lauren?
I'm going to let Cazilia or Becky field that one.
Okay. She'll need to
unmute.
Yes.
Thank you, Sue, for your question. Yes, self-control is perhaps a personality trait which has been looked at very much as a means to how people respond to nudges. Kahneman, in his book, writes a lot about self-control, for example. I also wanted to mention the World Bank report of 2015, who focuses explicitly on behavioral economics and nudges-based interventions. So it's a 2015 World Bank report, annual report.
Great, thank you. Becky, did you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many questions that we still have. So I think that's clearly there's a lot of different personality characteristics, and taking a deeper dive we're just still at the beginning really of this, unpacking this in our transition.
Here's a question from Barb. Any good activities to encourage future-mindedness and self-control? Khurram, do you have any activities? I think probably, the bean game and the SMART goals would both help with that. But do you have anything you want to contribute on that front?
To encourage future-mindedness and self-control, one of the things, so there's a couple things I do with my classes. If I'm doing a series, if I do budgeting with them, I kind of go step by step and having them, like every day or every time that we meet, I go over, okay, what did you spend money on the past week that we didn't meet? Because I try to have them at least record those things, and then I make sure to discuss them at the beginning of each class every time. So it kind of becomes almost like the default, like, oh, this is the first thing we're going to talk about, so I need to have this homework done. And that's like, and it's very, very simple because all they really have to do is write down what did they spend money on and how much was it. So just two simple things.
I can add a couple of things here.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Khurram. So the activity that I created from the Willpower Instinct book, will be available as an activity to simply bring awareness to our future self versus present self sort of mindset. I think it's fascinating. The research, the neuroscience shows that the region in our brains that lights up when we are talking about our future self is the same region of the brain that lights up when we're talking about somebody completely different. So that is very interesting in of itself and really powerful, I think. What people are doing with that, what I have read is that they'll put people into like a computer simulation where they see themselves age. And so I think the more that we can help people think about their aging, when I'm engaging my audiences, I say, well, you know, hopefully one day you will be old. And then I will often have them draw pictures of themselves in their older age. I encourage people to get to know their family, and if they don't have grandparents or aren't close to grandparents, to spend time at nursing homes, because I think a lot of young people just, we're not thinking that we're going to be old. And then lastly, Barbara, the little video that I included in my section, we didn't use the video, but it's on delayed gratification. It's a wonderful video, and it goes through, and it's short, and I use it with audiences, and it's funny. And I've actually done marshmallow like little experiments in different so.
That's super. I wanted to add to Cherry's question about how to the practical standpoint. From our research, Lauren and mine, we found that it's very important to test nudges with a small group of people. Maybe just take 1 month of enrollment take 1 month's worth of data, 1 month's worth of financial education program, and see how it works. Also very important is, if it's possible, to do a randomized control setup, so that there is a randomized assignment to a control group who does the standard financial education program, and a randomized assigned group who does the intervention, to be able to really compare whether it works.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, if you as a practitioner are interested in doing, as Cecilia said, us, you know, social scientists are always interested in helping with those types of projects. So if that's something that interests you, then certainly get in touch with your state specialist or any of us to think about ways that you can implement a test like that.
Yeah. And we are also happy to advise and provide feedback anytime.
Yeah.
All right, if there's nothing further, it looks like we've responded to all the questions. Lauren and company, Cazilia, Becky, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really interesting. I've enjoyed learning about this and look forward to sharing it with others. Any last brief statements?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Khurram and Becky and Cecilia for all participating, and to Laura and Mark for helping us organize, and of course to all the attendees for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Laura, do we have dates for next month's?
Always on the 4th Wednesday, same time, same station.
Yep. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.